Welcome to the Day's Explainer. Instead of just memorizing dates and battles, we're going to do something a bit different today. We're going to treat the massive Roman Empire like a living, breathing organism. Think about it. At its absolute peak, this single entity controlled roughly a quarter of the entire world's population. That is wild. So to understand how a machine that incredibly massive actually worked, and, well, why it ultimately died, we need to look at its anatomy. We'll ask things like, how did the brain communicate with the limbs? What was the lifeblood of its economy? And what were the systemic diseases that eventually brought the whole thing crashing down?
Okay, so here's the roadmap for our autopsy of an empire. We'll kick things off with piecing together the past, then track the shift from republic to centralized principate. After that, we'll dive into urban life and economy, take a look at the darker side in hierarchy and systemic slavery, and finally, map out the big collapse in the 3rd century crisis.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, Piecing Together the Past. To really wrap our heads around the sheer size of the Roman hegemony, you just need to keep one number in mind: 3. The Roman superpower spanned an incredible 3 continents. We're talking about vast, sprawling territories stretching across Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. To put that into perspective, a letter sent from Rome could take well over a month to reach the edges of the empire in Egypt or Britain. Managing a footprint that huge without the internet, phones, or rapid transit, it is a staggering logistical achievement. It required a totally unprecedented level of administration just to keep these wildly different regions unified under one single banner.
So how do we even know all this? Well, our understanding relies on a really fascinating 3-part methodology. First off, we've got the textual records. The histories, laws, and letters written by the Romans themselves. Second, there are the physical archaeological artifacts, which can be anything from massive monumental architecture down to a commoner's pocket change. But the third part, this is absolutely incredible. It's preserved papyri from the Nile. In ancient Egyptian garbage dumps, like the one at Oxyrhynchus, the incredibly dry climate preserved literally millions of everyday documents. We're talking tax receipts, shopping lists, personal letters, even military orders. It gives us this amazing, microscopic, high-definition look at the day-to-day operations of this superpower.
Moving right along to Section 2, Republic to Centralized Principate.
Now, politically speaking, the empire experienced this massive, dramatic pivot from a republic model to a highly centralized principate. See, for centuries, the republic operated with really complex checks and balances, and the whole point was to prevent any single man from holding absolute power. But as those borders expanded across the 3 continents we just talked about, the republican system literally buckled under the administrative weight. The solution? Engineered by Augustus, it was the Principate, and honestly, it was a masterstroke of political theater. He kept up the illusion of the old republic, calling himself simply First Citizen, while he quietly and very effectively funneled all the actual centralized executive power directly into his own hands. This whole setup created a highly tense power dynamic between 3 main pillars. At the very top, you have the emperor, holding centralized executive authority. He's the ultimate decision maker. But he couldn't rule in a vacuum, right? He had to manage the Senate. Now, the Senate was this traditional body that had lost its absolute control, but they still had massive wealth and social prestige. And finally, you have the true wild card of the bunch, the professional army. This highly trained standing force had the physical power to shift the political landscape overnight. At certain points, the military quite literally auctioned off the title of emperor to the highest bidder. Keeping this triangle from completely collapsing in on itself, that was pretty much the main job of any successful Roman leader.
Okay, that brings us to Section 3, Urban Life and Economy.
You see, the urban infrastructure of Rome wasn't just glittering and advanced. It was actually a really brilliant strategic tool. When you've got an empire spanning Europe, Africa, and Asia, you're dealing with immense cultural diversity. So to create a unified Roman identity, the state invested heavily in public works. Those elaborate public baths, they weren't just for getting clean. They served as huge community networking hubs. And the massive arenas for grand entertainment projected the sheer, undeniable power of the state. These things weren't just luxuries. They were psychological infrastructure used to integrate conquered peoples and keep those massive urban populations engaged, happy, and unified.
But behind all those grand buildings, the true economic lifeblood of the empire wasn't actually gold or silver. Nope, it was a globalized trade network fueled primarily by 3 main commodities: olive oil, wine, and grain. Grain was the absolute, non-negotiable necessity, imported in massive fleets from Egypt and North Africa just to feed the million-plus residents of Rome. And the sheer scale of this trade is mind-blowing. Even today in Rome, there's a literal mountain, Monte Testaccio, made entirely out of millions of broken, discarded olive oil jugs. It's crazy. This highly interconnected agricultural economy essentially bound these far-flung provinces together through total mutual economic dependence.
Let's shift gears now to Section 4, Hierarchy and Systemic Slavery. We have to acknowledge that all that glittering urban infrastructure we just talked about was sharply contrasted by a very dark fuel: systemic slave labor. We're talking about the widespread institutionalized exploitation of human beings, which was required to maintain the massive economic and infrastructural demands of this society. Viewed neutrally through the historical and economic data of the time, the entire Roman hegemony was inexorably tied to this institution. Those massive construction projects, the affordability of cheap everyday commodities, and the extreme lavish wealth of the elite, all of it rested entirely on this foundational layer of coerced labor.
Roman society was intensely stratified. You had senatorial elites at the very top and enslaved people at the absolute bottom. And the human cost required to maintain this hegemony, it was staggering. Historians estimate that at times, roughly 1 in 3 people in Italy were enslaved. They were the ones maintaining the vast agricultural estates that produced the grain, the wine, and the oil. They worked the incredibly dangerous mines, and they literally built the legendary aqueducts. Recognizing this immense, institutionalized human exploitation is absolutely critical if we want to understand the actual day-to-day mechanics of how this superpower sustained its golden age for as long as it did.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the 3rd Century Crisis. So how does a machine this powerful break down? Well, a cascade of failures compounded rapidly, turning a long period of stability into total systemic collapse. The year 180 marked the end of a long, golden age of relative peace and prosperity, but by 235, that tense power triangle we talked about earlier completely shattered, plunging Rome into the 3rd century crisis. This was a devastating 50-year stretch of military anarchy, rampant hyperinflation, and brutal civil wars where dozens of emperors were assassinated. The internal pressure was just so immense that by 284, the empire actually had to be formally divided in two just to remain administratively viable. But really, that was only a band-aid. It ultimately just delayed the inevitable, paving the way for the final collapse of the Western hegemony in the year 476.
So, what does all this mean, and why does this ancient history even matter today? Well, because it proves that empires aren't just static stone monuments. They are highly complex, living systems that are completely vulnerable to systemic shocks. From its vast trade routes down to its rigid social hierarchies, the Roman hegemony shows us exactly how interconnected a superpower truly is. When one pillar falls, whether that's political stability, a disrupted supply chain, or a breakdown in social cohesion, the entire structure threatens to topple. It really leaves us to wonder, are our modern hyper-interconnected global networks just as fragile? It's a fascinating thought to take with you. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.